What if the only thing more unsettling than working the midnight shift in a century-old train station was discovering there were no rules? At Ogden's Union Station after dark, the absence of regulations creates an atmosphere of pure suspense. Are you brave enough to find out what truly unfolds when the boundaries disappear and the unexpected takes over? The first time I saw Ogden's Union Station, I understood why they called it a jewel of the American West. The building rose against the Utah sky like a monument to ambition, its Spanish colonial revival architecture gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tourists wandered through its halls, cameras clicking, voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings as they admired the restored grandeur. The museum exhibits drew crowds, the cafe buzzed with conversation, and everything felt alive with purpose and order. That was daytime. I was hired as a night custodian 3 months ago, and I remember the hiring manager, a thin woman named Patricia with tired eyes, walking me through the building on a Tuesday afternoon. She showed me the boiler room, the storage closets, the breaker panels. Her voice was crisp and professional as she explained my duties. Lock the main doors at 10, complete a security sweep of all 3 floors, maintain the heating system, respond to any alarms. Standard stuff. Nothing I hadn't done at other locations. But then, as we stood in the grand hall with its terrazzo floors gleaming under the chandeliers, she paused. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the space, and Patricia turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The thing about night shift here," she said slowly, "is that you're going to be completely alone. No security guards, no other staff, no supervisors. Just you and this building from 10 at night until 6 in the morning." I nodded. I'd worked alone before. Solitude didn't bother me. "We don't have a lot of protocols for the overnight hours," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "The daytime operations are heavily regulated. Museum standards, public safety requirements, all of that. But after dark, when there's no public access, no staff, no tours, well, we just ask that you keep the building secure and address any maintenance issues." Something in her tone made me ask, "Is there a manual? A list of procedures I should follow?" Patricia's laugh was short and humorless. There was. We had one written up about 5 years ago, but the people who wrote it don't work here anymore. None of the night custodians last very long, and each one said the manual was inadequate. They kept wanting to add things, strange things, so eventually we just stopped maintaining it. I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed her on what she meant by strange things. But I needed the job, and the pay was surprisingly generous for custodial work. So I nodded and accepted the position, telling myself that an old building alone at night was still just an old building. My first night shattered that delusion within the first hour. The transformation began as the sun set. I arrived at 9:30, while the last daytime staff were packing up. The museum curator, a jovial man named Richard, waved goodbye as he left. The cafe worker, whose name I never learned, hurried out with barely a glance in my direction. Patricia was the last to leave, and she paused at the door, keys in hand. "Call my cell if there's an emergency," she said. "Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow evening." "What constitutes an emergency?" I asked. She thought about this for a long moment. "Honestly, don't know anymore. Use your judgment, Daniel." Then she was gone, and I was alone. The silence descended like a physical weight. During the day, the station hummed with ambient noise. Conversations, footsteps, the cafe's coffee machine, the HVAC system working to cool the space. But now, in the emptiness, every sound became distinct and somehow wrong. The heating system ticked and groaned as it adjusted to the evening temperature. The building settled with creaks that sounded almost like footsteps on the upper floors. Somewhere a pipe knocked rhythmically, 3 beats in succession, then silence, then 3 beats again. I started my rounds, following the mental checklist Patricia had given me. Lock the main entrance. Check the windows on the ground floor. Ensure the exhibit cases were secure. Simple tasks, but in the vast emptiness of the station, they took on an almost ritualistic quality. The grand hall looked different at night. The chandeliers, dimmed to save power, cast weak pools of light that left the corners in deep shadow. The terrazzo floor, so beautiful in daylight, now seemed to stretch endlessly, creating a sense of space that was both magnificent and oppressive. My footsteps echoed with each step, the sound bouncing off walls and ceiling until it seemed like someone was walking parallel to me, matching my pace exactly. I stopped. The echo stopped a fraction of a second later. This happened 3 more times as I crossed the hall, and each time, that delayed echo sent a chill down my spine. It was probably just acoustics, the way sound traveled through the empty building. But knowing the logical explanation didn't make it feel any less unsettling. The second floor was worse. The museum exhibits on this level focused on the station's history. Photographs of trains from the early 1900s, displays showing what the waiting rooms looked like in their heyday, mannequins dressed in period clothing. During the day, these exhibits were charming and educational. At night, the mannequins looked disturbingly lifelike, their glass eyes catching the dim emergency lighting in a way that suggested awareness. I found myself avoiding looking at them directly as I passed. Instead, I focused on my checklist. Check the temperature sensors. Verify the display cases were locked. Note any maintenance issues. But I could feel those glass eyes on my back, and several times I spun around, certain that I'd heard fabric rustling, that one of the figures had moved. They never had, of course. They stood exactly as they'd been positioned, frozen in their recreated scenes of waiting passengers and station workers. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me walk faster than necessary. The third floor housed administrative offices and storage rooms, and it was here that I first noticed something genuinely strange. The offices were locked, as expected, but as I walked past them, checking that each door was secure, I noticed that several had lights on inside. Not bright overhead lights, but the soft glow of desk lamps visible under the door gaps and through the frosted glass windows. I checked my phone. It was nearly 11. Everyone had left by 9:30. Maybe they'd just forgotten to turn off the lamps. It happened. But there were 5 offices with lights on, scattered throughout the floor, and the thought of 5 different people all forgetting seemed unlikely. I stood in the hallway, keys in hand, debating whether to unlock the offices and turn off the lights. Patricia had said to use my judgment, but she'd also said the offices were off limits unless there was a specific maintenance issue. Were lights left on an issue? In the end, I decided to leave them. I noted it in my mental list of things to mention tomorrow and continued my rounds. But as I walked away, I swore I heard the distinct sound of a chair rolling across a hard floor, coming from one of the lit offices behind me. I didn't look back. By midnight, I'd completed my initial sweep and returned to the small custodial office on the ground floor that served as my base. The room was cramped, containing a desk, a filing cabinet, and an ancient coffee maker that gurgled and hissed as I brewed a cup. I sat at the desk and pulled out the folder Patricia had given me, labeled Night Operations. Inside were 3 pages. The first listed my basic duties in bullet points. The second showed a floor plan of the building. The third was blank except for a single handwritten sentence at the top. Trust your instincts. Below that, someone had crossed out several lines of text so thoroughly that I couldn't make out a single word. At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, was another note. The building remembers everything. I stare at these cryptic messages, trying to understand what previous night custodians had been trying to communicate. But the crossed out sections revealed nothing, and the remaining phrases were too vague to be useful. That's when I realized the truth of my situation. There were no rules here, no procedures, no guidance. I was alone in this vast, historic building with nothing but my own judgment to guide me through the next 8 hours. And somehow, that absence of structure felt more terrifying than any specific instruction could have been. The coffee tasted bitter and somehow metallic, but I drank it anyway, needing the warmth and the routine more than the caffeine. Outside my small office, the station stretched in all directions, silent and waiting. The heating system continued its rhythmic ticking, and somewhere on the upper floors, that pipe knocked its 3-beat pattern again. I'd worked night shifts at other locations, office buildings, shopping malls, even a hospital once. There is always a protocol, always a clear set of expectations. At the hospital, I'd had a checklist with 17 specific tasks to complete each night. At the mall, there were hourly security patrols following a predetermined route. Structure, order, rules. Here, there was nothing. The disconnect was immediate and profound. Without rules to follow, every decision became a negotiation with myself. Should I patrol every hour or every 2 hours? Should I investigate every strange sound or only the ones that repeated? Should I touch anything or leave everything exactly as I found it? I decided to walk the building again, partly because it seemed like the responsible thing to do, and partly because sitting alone in that cramped office was making my skin crawl. Armed with my flashlight and the ring of keys Patricia had given me, I ventured back in the grand hall. It was 12:30 in the morning, and the building felt different than it had during my first rounds. Colder, somehow, though the thermostat read the same temperature. The shadows seemed deeper, pooling in the corners and alcoves with an almost liquid quality, and the silence had developed a strange texture, not quite empty, but filled with the absence of sound, if that made any sense. My footsteps echoed less now, absorbed by the darkness in a way that defied physics. I aimed my flashlight beam down the western corridor, watching it illuminate the polished floors and display cases. Everything looked normal. Everything looked wrong. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. Cigarette smoke, old and stale, mixed with something else. Perfume, maybe your cologne. The kind of scent that might linger in a busy space, except the station had been smoke-free for decades, and I was the only person in the building. I followed the smell toward the old waiting room, a preserved section of the station that had been restored to its 1920s appearance. The scent grew stronger as I approached, and with it came another element, the smell of coal smoke, thick and acrid, like from a steam locomotive. The waiting room doors were closed. I'd locked them myself during the first rounds, but now they stood slightly ajar, a gap of perhaps 3 inches between the double doors. I stopped, my heart rate increasing. I remembered closing those doors. I remembered the satisfying click of the latch catching. I'd even tugged on them to make sure they were secure. Now they were open. Use your judgment, Patricia's voice echoed in my memory. But what judgment was I supposed to use here? Investigate? Ignore it? Call someone and say what? That doors I'd locked were now unlocked. That I smelled phantom cigarette smoke. I could already imagine the response. Old buildings shift. Latches don't always catch. The HVAC system circulates all sorts of smells. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the waiting room. The restoration was impressive. Wooden benches arranged in neat rows. Vintage luggage stacked artfully in the corners. Even the old arrival and departure board hung on the wall, its mechanical letters frozen in time, announcing trains that would never arrive. In daylight, this room was popular with photographers and history enthusiasts. At night, it felt like a trap. The smell of cigarette smoke was overwhelming here, and now I could hear something too. The faint murmur of conversation, too distant to make out words, but distinctly human. Multiple voices, men and women, talking over each other the way crowds do. But I was alone. I swept my flashlight across the room, its beam cutting through the darkness. The benches were empty. The luggage hadn't moved. Nothing looked disturbed. Yet the sounds continued, and I realized with a creeping sense of dread that they seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Not from any specific direction, but from the room itself. My training in other buildings would have told me to investigate systematically, to check every corner, to find the logical source. But here, with no rules, no protocol, no backup, I found myself backing toward the door. Some instinct, deep and primal, was screaming at me to leave this room. Not to run, but to withdraw carefully, respectfully, like backing away from a wild animal. I pulled the doors closed behind me and stood in the corridor, breathing hard. The sound stopped immediately. The smell faded within seconds. I locked the doors again, checking twice to make sure the latch caught. Then I returned to my office, made another cup of terrible coffee, and tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Old buildings had acoustics that could be strange. The pipes, the HVAC system, the settling of the structure could create sounds that seemed like voices. The smell could have been coming from outside, drawn in through some crack or vent. Everything had a logical explanation, except I didn't believe any of it. The rest of that first night passed in a state of hypervigilance. I did another patrol at 2 a.m, this time avoiding the waiting room entirely. The offices on the 3rd floor still had their lights on. I heard footsteps above me twice, distinct and measured, when I was on the 2nd floor, despite the fact that I just checked the 3rd floor and found it empty. At 3:30, I discovered water pooling near the old ticket counter, despite no visible leak and no water pipes in that section of the ceiling. By 4, I'd given up trying to apply logic to the situation and simply accepted that the building was going to do inexplicable things. The hardest part wasn't the strange occurrences themselves. It was the lack of framework for dealing with them. If I'd had a manual that said, ignore all sounds after midnight, or lights in offices are normal, don't investigate, I could have followed those instructions. I would have had something external to rely on. Instead, I was making everything up as I went along, and every decision felt wrong. When I heard footsteps, should I investigate or ignore them? When I found doors unlocked, should I lock them or leave them? When I smelled cigarette smoke, should I search for the source or pretend I hadn't noticed? The freedom was paralyzing. I started creating my own rules, arbitrary ones just to give myself some structure. Rule 1, patrol every 90 minutes. Rule 2, only investigate sounds if they happen 3 times. Rule 3, avoid the waiting room between midnight and 4 a.m. These rules had no basis in anything Patricia had told me, no connection to actual building management or security protocols. They were pure superstition, invented barriers against the chaos of the unknown. But they helped. They gave me something to hold on to in the formless darkness of those hours. By 5 a.m, exhaustion was setting in, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the night finally fading. I was in the grand hall, doing one final patrol before the end of my shift when I saw the figure. It was at the far end of the hall, near the western staircase. A man, I thought, though in the dim emergency lighting, I couldn't make out details. He was walking slowly, purposefully, moving from left to right across my field of vision. He wore what looked like a uniform, dark and formal. I called out, "Hey, the station is closed." The figure didn't respond, didn't even pause. He continued his steady walk until he reached the wall, and then he simply continued, not through a door, not around a corner. He walked directly into the solid wall and disappeared. I stood frozen, my flashlight pointed at the spot where he'd vanished. The wall was unbroken, no doors, no alcoves, nothing, just solid plaster and paint. For a long moment, I didn't move, couldn't move. My brain refused to process what I'd seen, cycling through denial and rationalization. Trick of the light, my own shadow, exhaustion-induced hallucination. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that no amount of rules or protocols would have prepared me for it. When Patricia arrived at 6 to start her day, she found me sitting on the bench outside the main entrance, despite the morning chill. She looked at me with that same tired expression from the interview, the one that suggested she'd seen this reaction before. "Your first night," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "You'll get used to it," she continued, unlocking the main doors. "Where you won't. Most people don't last a week." "The waiting room," I started, then stopped, unsure how to phrase my question. Should I be locking it? Patricia paused with her hand on the door. "Do whatever feels right. That's all anyone can do here after dark." She went inside, and I followed, grateful for the arrival of daylight and other people. But I knew I'd be back tonight, facing the same impossible situation. 8 hours alone in a building where the only rule was that there were no rules at all. And somehow, I had to find a way to survive it. I didn't go home that first morning. Instead, I found an all-night diner 3 blocks from the station and spent 2 hours drinking coffee and researching Ogden's Union Station on my phone. If the building was going to throw impossible things at me, I wanted to understand why. The history was more complicated than I'd realized. The station opened in 1924, a grand monument to the railroad industry's golden age. For decades, it served as a crucial hub where multiple rail lines converged, processing thousands of passengers and workers every day. Politicians gave speeches from its platforms. Soldiers departed for both world wars through its gates. Families reunited in its halls, and others said final goodbyes that echoed through the decades. But there were darker stories too. In 1929, a porter named William Garrett died when he fell between 2 platforms during a shift change. The investigation called it an accident, though some reports suggested foul play. In 1943, a young woman jumped from the 3rd-floor balcony onto the grand hall floor below, leaving only a cryptic suicide note about missing the last train. Multiple people had died of heart attacks in the building over the years. And in 1971, as rail travel declined and the station faced an uncertain future, the night watchman was found dead in the boiler room under circumstances that were never fully explained. The station had officially closed to rail service in 1977, sitting abandoned for years before being restored and reopened as a museum in the late 1980s. During the restoration, workers reportedly refused to work night shifts, citing strange occurrences. One construction supervisor quit after finding all his tools rearranged every morning, despite locked doors. Another worker claimed to have seen the spectral form of a conductor on the platforms, checking a pocket watch that no longer existed. I found a local news article from 1992 about the museum's early years. It mentioned that the night security position had a turnover rate of almost 300%, with most guards lasting less than a month. The museum director at the time dismissed concerns, calling the building atmospheric and blaming overactive imaginations. But buried in a forum dedicated to railroad history, I found something more concrete, a scanned copy of a journal entry from a night custodian who'd worked at the station in 1997. The entry was dated October 15th, 3rd week on the job. I've tried to establish a routine, some sense of normalcy, but the building resists structure. It's as if Union Station remembers its purpose too well. Between midnight and 4, I hear announcements over the intercom system, even though it's been disconnected for years. The announcements are clear enough to understand. Trains arriving, trains departing, track numbers, destinations. Places that don't exist anymore on the rail lines. Last night, I heard one that chilled me to my core. Now arriving on track 3, special service to the end of the line. All passengers must board. Final call. I checked track 3. There was nothing there, of course, but the announcement repeated 3 times, each more insistent than the last. I've stopped trying to investigate everything I see and hear. There's no protocol for ghost trains. There's no procedure for handling buildings that won't let go of their past. I just try to stay out of the way and let history play itself out around me. The entry ended there, with no further entries from that custodian. According to the employment record someone had posted, he quit 2 days after writing it. I closed my phone and stared out the diner window at the pre-dawn darkness, feeling a kinship with that unnamed custodian from 27 years ago. He tried to create structure too, had struggled with the same lack of protocols, and he'd ultimately failed. What made me think I could do any better? That night, my second shift, I returned with a different mindset. Instead of trying to impose order on the building, I would observe. I would pay attention to the patterns, to the rhythms of whatever was happening here. Maybe understanding would come through acceptance rather than resistance. The evening started quietly enough. I locked the doors at 10, did my initial sweep, and settled into the custodial office with my terrible coffee. But tonight I brought a notebook, and I was determined to document everything. 10:47 p.m. Pipe knocking pattern begins. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Consistent timing, approximately every 4 minutes. 11:15 p.m. Temperature drop in Grand Hall. Thermostat shows no change, but I can see my breath. Lasts approximately 3 minutes, then returns to normal. 11:33 p.m. Footsteps on 3rd floor, moving east to west. Check floor, found nothing. Pattern suggests someone walking the full length of the corridor without stopping. 11:45 p.m. Smell of coal smoke near platforms. Strong, then fading quickly. As midnight approached, I positioned myself in the Grand Hall, notebook in hand, waiting. Patricia had mentioned that the manual's previous authors wanted to add strange things to it. I was beginning to understand what those things might be. At exactly midnight, the intercom crackled to life. The sound made me jump, even though I'd been half expecting it based on the journal entry I'd read. But hearing it was different from reading about it. The static hissed and popped, and then a voice emerged, tinny and distant, like from an old recording. Now boarding on track 1, westbound service to San Francisco. All ticketed passengers, please proceed to the platform. Now boarding. The announcement was crisp and professional, exactly like you'd hear in a functioning train station. But Union Station hadn't seen passenger service in nearly 50 years. I walked toward the old platform access, my footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the silence that followed the announcement. The doors to the platform had been sealed and converted into a display about the station's operational history. But as I approached, I could have sworn I heard voices beyond those sealed doors. People talking, laughing, the shuffle of feet, the thump of luggage being moved. The sounds of a busy train platform, happening in a space that no longer existed. I pressed my ear against the door, and the sounds grew clearer. A child asking when the train would arrive. A woman's voice, stern and efficient, directing people to form lines. The distinctive hiss of a steam locomotive, that particular sound of pressure building and releasing. Then, cutting through it all, scream. It was brief, sharp, full of terror. It came from behind the sealed door, from the impossible platform beyond, and it was followed by a sudden, absolute silence. The voices stopped. The sounds of the train ceased. Even the ambient noises of the building seemed to hold their breath. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering. In my notebook, with shaking hands, I wrote, 12:03 a.m. Announcement for track 1. Sounds of platform activity beyond sealed door. Scream heard, then silence. Unable to investigate. Should I be trying to help someone who might have existed 80 years ago? The question haunted me as I continued my rounds. The building's past wasn't just memory. It was active, present, playing out in real time around me. And I had no framework for dealing with that reality. No rule that said, ignore phantom screams, or respond to crisis calls from 1940. On the 2nd floor, I found one of the mannequins had moved. I was certain of it. The figure representing a passenger waiting on a bench was now standing beside the bench, its hand raised as if hailing someone. I pulled out my phone and found the photo I'd taken during my first night, comparing it to what I saw now. The mannequin had definitely moved. Its posture, its position, everything was different. I approached it slowly, examining it for any mechanical explanation. Maybe it was on some kind of hidden track system, moved by museum staff for different displays. But when I looked closely at its base, I saw dust, undisturbed and thick, suggesting it hadn't been moved by human hands in months. The mannequin's glass eye stared past me, fixed on some point in the distance. I followed its gaze and realized it was looking at the spot where the third-floor balcony overlooked this level. The same balcony from which that young woman had jumped in 1943. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. At 1:30, I was on the third floor, checking the offices, when I noticed something new. One of the lit offices, the one closest to the stairwell, had a shadow moving behind its frosted glass. A person-shaped shadow, pacing back and forth with agitated energy. I stopped outside the door and listened. From within came the sound of papers rustling, a drawer being opened and slammed shut, and then a voice, muffled but audible. "Where is it? Where did I put it?" The voice was male, stressed, with an accent I couldn't quite place. He was searching for something, growing increasingly frantic. I knocked on the door. "Hello, is someone in there?" The sound stopped immediately. The shadow froze mid-pace. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the light went out. I tried the door handle, even though I knew it would be locked. I pulled out my keys, found the right one, and unlocked the door. The office beyond was dark and empty. No papers on the desk. No drawers open. The dust on the surfaces was undisturbed, suggesting no one had been in this room for days, possibly weeks. But I'd seen the shadow. I'd heard the voice. In my notebook, I wrote, 1:36 a.m., third floor office. Man searching for something. Light went out when I knocked. Office empty when opened. Question: if I hadn't knocked, would he have continued? Are these events recordings or something more interactive? The thought that these manifestations might be aware of me, might be responding to my presence, was somehow more unsettling than the idea that they were simply replaying past events. At 2:15, I returned to the Grand Hall and found wet footprints leading from the old ticket counter toward the western corridor. The footprints were clear, fresh, made by dress shoes based on the tread pattern. They glistened in the emergency lighting, water pooling slightly in each impression. I followed them, watching as they led down the corridor, turned at the old baggage claim, and continued toward the waiting room. The same waiting room I decided to avoid during certain hours. The footprints stopped at the closed doors. I stood there, staring at those wet impressions, and I thought about William Garrett, the porter who died in 1929. Had he been wearing dress shoes? Had he walked the same path on his last night? Was this his final journey, replayed endlessly for reasons beyond my comprehension? The waiting room doors rattled gently, as if someone on the other side was testing the latch. Once, twice, then stillness. I didn't open them. Some instinct told me that whatever was inside needed to stay inside, at least for now. Instead, I made a note about the footprints and returned to my office, leaving history to work itself out without my interference. The rest of the night brought a cascade of smaller occurrences. The elevator arriving at the ground floor and opening, despite no one calling it. The sound of typing coming from the sealed business office. A cold spot near the old telegraph station that seemed to move through the building, following a route I couldn't predict. By morning, I'd filled 12 pages of my notebook with observations, questions, and half-formed theories. When Patricia arrived, I showed her the notes. She flipped through them slowly, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she handed the notebook back and said simply, "You're documenting them." "Shouldn't I be?" "Most people don't last long enough to develop a system," she replied. "They either run screaming after the first night or convince themselves everything has a rational explanation and quit when the cognitive dissonance becomes too much." What about the people who wrote the original manual? Patricia smiled sadly. They try to create rules around the occurrences. Don't enter the waiting room after midnight. Don't respond if the intercom calls your name. Don't touch the mannequins, even if they move. But the building didn't follow their rules. It kept doing new things, unexpected things. Eventually, they realized you can't regulate the past. So what am I supposed to do? What you're doing. Watch. Document. Try to understand. She paused at the door. But Daniel, don't get too comfortable with them. Don't start thinking of these things as harmless recordings. The building has a memory, yes, but memory can be dangerous when it's strong enough to interact with the present. She left me without warning, and I went home to sleep, my dreams filled with phantom footsteps and impossible train platforms where the past and present collided in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. After 2 weeks of night shifts, I developed a routine that would have seemed absurd to anyone outside Union Station. At 10, I'd lock the doors and do a quick sweep, noting which offices had lights on and whether the mannequins had moved from the previous positions. At 11, I'd position myself in the grand hall to hear the midnight announcement. At 1, I checked the third floor for the searching man in the office. At 2:30, I'd avoid the waiting room entirely and instead patrol the basement level, where the building's mechanical heart pumped and groaned. These weren't official procedures. They were coping mechanisms, ways of creating predictability in an environment that defied logic. I was learning to coexist with the impossible, but coexistence came with a cost. I stopped sleeping well during the day. Even in my apartment, miles from Union Station, I'd wake at random hours convinced I'd heard the 3-beat knock of the pipes or smelled coal smoke. My dreams were filled with train platforms and sealed doors, with voices calling out destinations that no longer existed. I'd find myself reaching for my notebook, wanting to document dream events as if they were as real as the ones at the station. The boundaries were blurring. On my 17th night, something changed. I arrived to find another person in the building, a young woman, probably mid-20s, standing in the grand hall with a camera and what looked like audio recording equipment. "Who are you?" I asked, more sharply than I'd intended. She jumped, clearly not expecting anyone else. "Oh God, you scared me. I'm Jessica, from the Utah Paranormal Research Society. The museum director gave us permission to investigate tonight." She didn't tell you. Patricia hadn't mentioned anything. But then, Patricia rarely told me anything beyond the basics. "I'm the night custodian," I said. "I'll be here all night, so don't be alarmed when you hear me walking around." Jessica's face lit up. "Actually, would you mind answering some questions? We're trying to document the reported activity here, and your perspective would be invaluable. You work here every night, right?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to share my notebook, to show someone else the patterns I've been tracking. But another part, the part that had adapted to the building's strange rhythms, resisted. The occurrences felt almost private, like a secret between me and Union Station. "What do you want to know?" I asked finally. "Have you experienced anything unusual? Unexplained sounds, visual phenomena, temperature changes?" I could have told her everything. The announcements, the footsteps, the figure who walked through walls, the office where a man eternally searched for something he'd never find. Instead, I said, "Sometimes the building makes strange noises. Old structures do that." Jessica looked disappointed, but not surprised. A lot of staff members are reluctant to talk about their experiences. They think they'll sound crazy. Maybe they just don't want to turn their workplace into a spectacle. I replied, more defensively than I'd intended. She spent the next 3 hours setting up equipment throughout the building: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, audio recorders. I watched her work, feeling an inexplicable sense of protective territorialism. These were my ghosts, my mysteries. Why did she have to document them? The thought shocked me with its possessiveness. When had I started thinking of the manifestations as belonging to anyone, let alone to me? At midnight, Jessica was positioned in the grand hall with her equipment when the intercom crackled to life. Now arriving on track 2, eastbound service to Chicago. All passengers please stand behind the yellow line. Now arriving. Jessica gasped, fumbling with her audio recorder. Did you hear that? Did you hear it? It's just the old intercom system, I said automatically. Sometimes it picks up radio signals. But the system isn't even connected anymore. I checked. She was reviewing her equipment readings. Excitement evident in every movement. The EMF detector is going crazy, and the temperature just dropped 7 degrees in 30 seconds. I could see my breath in the air, confirming what her instruments showed. But I felt an irrational anger at her excitement, at the way she was treating this like a scientific phenomenon to be studied rather than... What did I think it was? Around 1:30, as I was doing my rounds on the 3rd floor, I heard Jessica scream from the 2nd floor. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding, and found her backed against a wall, staring at the mannequin display. It moved, she stammered. I was filming it, and it just turned its head, not all at once, but slowly like it was alive. Do you see? It's looking at a different spot now than it was in my earlier footage. I looked at the mannequin representing the waiting passenger. It was indeed facing a different direction than it had been during my 10 o'clock sweep. But I'd seen this happen dozens of times. It was just what the mannequins did. They shift sometimes, I told her. Old joints, settling materials. It's normal. Normal. Jessica's voice was shrill with disbelief. A solid figure made of plaster and metal doesn't just shift its position. And the way it moved, it was deliberate, purposeful. Maybe you should pack up your equipment, I suggested. This building isn't for everyone. She stared at me. You work here every night. You must have seen things. Why are you pretending nothing's happening? Because accepting that things are happening doesn't mean I have to make a show of it, I snapped. These occurrences, phenomena, whatever you want to call them, they're not entertainment. They're not content for your research society. They're part of this building, and maybe they should be left alone. Jessica gathered her equipment and left before 3 in the morning, her excitement thoroughly crushed by a combination of fear and my inexplicable hostility. After she was gone, I sat in the grand hall and tried to understand my own reaction. When had I stopped being afraid? When had the building's strangeness become something I felt protective of rather than threatened by? The answer came slowly. Somewhere in those first 2 weeks, I'd stopped trying to understand or explain what was happening and had simply accepted it. The announcements, the footsteps, the moving mannequins, they were constant in my nights, as predictable in their unpredictability as anything in my life. They'd become companions of a sort, presences that made me feel less alone in the vast empty building. It was a disturbing realization. I was becoming attached to ghosts. The next few nights, I tested my new theory by deliberately breaking my routines. Instead of positioning myself in the grand hall at midnight, I stayed in my office. The announcement happened anyway, but somehow it felt muted, distant, like I'd disappointed someone by not being there to witness it. On the 2nd floor, I spoke aloud to the moving mannequin. I see you, I said. I know you're there. The mannequin didn't react in any obvious way, but that night I found it positioned exactly as it had been on my first shift, as if it had reset to some default state. A response? Or coincidence? I started leaving small markers around the building. A coin on the ticket counter, a pen on the waiting room bench, a paper clip on the 3rd floor office door. Each morning, some hadn't moved, others remained untouched. There was a pattern, but I couldn't decipher it. It felt like communication, but in a language I didn't speak. The isolation was affecting me in other ways too. When Patricia spoke to me at shift changes, I found myself resenting her presence, eager for her to leave so I could be alone with the building again. During my days off, I felt restless, incomplete, missing the rhythm of the night shifts. I was 23 days into the job when I experienced something that shook me from my comfortable coexistence. It was 3 in the morning. I was doing a routine patrol of the basement level, where the old boiler room and maintenance areas were located. This was usually the quietest part of the building, the manifestations seeming to prefer the public spaces above. But tonight I heard singing. A man's voice, deep and resonant, singing a song I didn't recognize. The melody was mournful, the kind of song you'd sing while working alone to pass the time. It was coming from the boiler room. I approached slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was a maze of pipes and machinery, shadows upon shadows, and the singing echoed in strange ways, making it hard to pinpoint the source. The boiler room door stood open. Inside, illuminated by my flashlight, I saw the massive old boiler, decommissioned decades ago, and standing beside it, transparent but clearly visible, was a man. He wore overalls and a work shirt, both stained with coal dust. His face was weathered, middle-aged, and he was singing while adjusting valves on the boiler, his hands moving through the machinery as if it were still operational, as if he were still alive. This was different from the other manifestations. This wasn't a sound without a source or shadow behind frosted glass. This was a full apparition, detailed and present. And as I stood there, frozen, the man stopped singing. He turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were sad, infinitely sad, and filled with a recognition that chilled me to my core. He saw me, not as an intrusion into his memory, but as a person, a fellow night worker, sharing the same space across the gulf of time. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I waited, my breath caught in my throat. But no sound came. His form flickered, like a failing light bulb, and then he was gone. I stood in the empty boiler room for a long time, my flashlight beam trembling slightly from the shaking of my hand. For weeks, I'd been documenting, adapting, even finding comfort in the building's phenomena. But seeing that man, seeing the sadness in his eyes, reminded me that these weren't just atmospheric quirks or interesting patterns. These were people, or echoes of people, trapped in their routines, their final moments, their unfinished business. And I was the only living witness to their eternal replay. The weight of that realization pressed down on me as I climbed the stairs back to the ground floor. What was I doing here, really? Documenting ghosts, keeping them company, pretending that coexisting with the past was normal or healthy. When my shift ended at 6 and Patricia arrived, she took one look at me and asked what happened. I told her about the man in the boiler room, about how he'd looked at me, really seen me. Who was he? I asked. The night watchman who died in 1971. Patricia shook her head slowly. The watchman died upstairs in the office. But in the 1930s and 40s, there were coal men who worked the overnight shifts, keeping the boilers running for the next day's service. Hard, lonely work. Most of them were immigrants, men whose names were barely recorded in the station's employment records. He looked so sad, I said quietly. Wouldn't you be? Doing the same task for eternity, never finishing, never resting. Patricia touched my shoulder gently. This is why most people don't last, Daniel. It's not the fear that gets them. It's the empathy. Once you start seeing them as people rather than phenomena, it breaks your heart every night. She was right. That night, my 24th shift, I walked through Union Station with new eyes. The announcements weren't just ghostly recordings. They represented a station master who'd taken such pride in his work that he couldn't stop, even in death. The footsteps were William Garrett, eternally walking his final route. The searching man in the office was someone who'd lost something precious and would never find it. And the building itself. It was a vast repository of unfinished moments, of people whose lives had been so intertwined with this place that they couldn't leave, even when their bodies had long since turned to dust. I was the night custodian of a mausoleum of memories, and there was no manual that could teach me how to care for the dead. By my 30th night at Union Station, I'd stopped going home between shifts. My apartment felt foreign, too quiet, stripped of the weight and presence that filled the station. Instead, I'd find coffee shops or libraries during the day, sleeping in my car for a few hours before returning for another 8-hour vigil. Patricia noticed but said nothing, only leaving a pillow and blanket in the custodial office with a note. Take care of yourself too. But taking care of myself felt impossible when I was witnessing the desperate repetition of the past every single night. The patterns had become clearer. The midnight announcement always called for either track 1, 2, or 3, never track 4. After some research at the library, I discovered that track 4 had been the site of a deadly accident in 1937, when a switching error caused 2 trains to collide, killing 4 people. The station had never assigned that track number again. The mannequins moved only on nights when the moon was visible through the Grand Hall skylights. On overcast nights, they remained perfectly still. I had no explanation for this correlation, but the consistency was undeniable. The wet footprints leading to the waiting room appeared exactly every 3 nights, always at 2:15 in the morning. I'd started photographing them, documenting their slow fade as if tracking a supernatural tide. But understanding the patterns didn't make them easier to bear. If anything, the predictability made it worse. These weren't random hauntings, but deeply grooved routines, souls caught in loops they couldn't break. And I was the audience to their eternal performance. On my 33rd night, I broke my own rule about the waiting room. It was 2:15, and the footprints had appeared on schedule, leading to those sealed doors. But tonight, instead of observing from a distance, I unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The smell of cigarette smoke hit me immediately, along with that coal smoke scent I'd come to associate with the building's most intense manifestations. The room was exactly as I'd left it hours earlier. Wooden benches in neat rows, vintage luggage arranged artfully, the old departure board frozen in time. But overlaying the static scene was something else, visible now that I'd entered their space. Translucent figures filled the benches, dozens of them, dressed in clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1920s traveling dress sat next to a man in a 1940s military uniform. A family from the 1950s occupied one whole bench, their children clutching toys that were barely visible. They were all waiting. None of them looked at me. Their attention was fixed on the arrival board, watching for trains that would never come, waiting for journeys that had been interrupted by death or time or the simple dissolution of memory. I walked among them slowly, and it was like moving through projections, though I could feel a cold pressure as I passed through their space. They remained focused on their eternal vigil, and I understood with sudden clarity what this room represented. This wasn't where active moments replayed. This was the waiting room in the most literal sense, where the dead waited for whatever came next, unable or unwilling to move forward until their train was called. A child's voice, clear and startling in its specificity, asked, "Mommy, when will our train come?" A woman's voice, tired and patient, "Soon, sweetheart. Soon." How long had they been having that exchange? Decades? A century? I backed out of the room carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb them, and closed the doors. My hand was shaking. I'd wanted to understand the building's phenomena, to find meaning in the patterns. But this understanding brought only a crushing sense of helplessness. I couldn't help them. I couldn't release them. I could only witness. The realization sent me back to my office, where I sat staring at my notebook filled with observations and patterns. What was the point of any of this documentation? What did I think I was accomplishing? At 4 a.m, I heard footsteps approaching my office. Steady, purposeful, accompanied by the jingle of keys. I looked up to see a translucent figure standing in my doorway. An older man in a custodian's uniform, though his outfit was from the 1950s based on the style. He looked at me with recognition, one-night worker to another across the decades. "You see them too," he said, his voice hollow and distant, like speaking through water. "All of us who worked the night shift, we saw them. We try to help. We thought if we understood the patterns, found the right routine, we could, I don't know, set them free, give them peace. What happened to you? I asked, finding my voice. I worked here for 11 years. 11 years of nights among the dead. It became my whole life. My wife left. My friends stopped calling. There was only the station, only the ghosts. One night, I was doing my rounds, and I realized I couldn't remember what the sun looked like. Couldn't remember what music sounded like. I'd become as much a ghost as they were. He stepped closer, and I could see through him to the filing cabinet behind. I had a heart attack right here, in this office. They found me the next morning. And now, he gestured at himself, at his translucent form. Now I'm part of the pattern too. Just another night worker who couldn't leave. How do I avoid that? I whispered. Leave, he said simply. Leave before the building becomes more real than the world outside. Leave before you forget why the sunrise matters. Leave before you become another ghost documenting ghosts. He faded gradually, like mist in morning light, until I was alone again. I sat there as the night ticked toward morning, thinking about his warning. I thought about Patricia's tired eyes, about the journal entry from a 1997 custodian, about all the night workers who tried and failed to find stability in this unstable place. The freedom of having no rules had seemed terrifying at first, but the real terror wasn't the absence of structure. It was the necessity of creating your own boundaries in an environment that constantly pushed against any limits you tried to establish. It was the slow erosion of the line between the living world and the world of memory and echo. When Patricia arrived at 6, I told her I was quitting. She didn't seem surprised. 33 nights. That's longer than most. The custodian who died in this office, I said. What was his name? Robert Hensley. They found him slumped over the desk in 1959. Heart attack. She paused. You saw him? I nodded. He warned me to leave before I became like him. Patricia pulled out a folder from the filing cabinet, a different one than she'd given me on my first day. Inside were dozens of resignation letters spanning decades, all from night custodians, all saying variations of the same thing. I can't distinguish between the past and present anymore. The building's memories are overwhelming my own. I'm becoming one of them. Every night worker eventually faces a choice, Patricia said. Accept that you're just passing through, a temporary observer of things beyond your control, and leave before it consumes you. Or stay, document, try to help, and risk becoming part of what you're observing. Is there anyone who's stayed without losing themselves? No, she admitted. The longest anyone lasted was 8 months, back in 2003. By the end, she was having full conversations with people no one else could see. She left on her own, thankfully, before. Patricia trailed off. Before she died here and stayed forever, I finished. I cleaned out my locker, which contained only my notebook and the pillow Patricia had given me. As I walked through the grand hall one final time in daylight, with tourists already beginning to trickle in for the day's museum visits, I saw it with different eyes. This beautiful, historic building was a trap, not a malicious one. Just a place where the weight of the past was so heavy that it bent reality, creating pockets where time didn't flow correctly, where the dead couldn't move on, and where the living could easily slip into those same stuck patterns. The absence of rules wasn't the problem. The problem was that in a place without rules, you had to create your own meaning, your own purpose, your own boundaries. And in a building filled with so much existing meaning, decades of purpose and routine from thousands of people who'd passed through its halls, it was nearly impossible not to absorb those meanings into yourself until you couldn't remember which purposes were yours and which were echoes. I turned in my keys and drove away from Ogden's Union Station for the last time. In my rearview mirror, I could see it standing against the Utah sky, grand and beautiful and quietly, persistently wrong. A week later, I was working day shifts at a modern office building with bright fluorescent lights, detailed protocol manuals, and security cameras everywhere. The rules were extensive and specific. The environment was boring and predictable. The other workers were alive and present, and spoke about ordinary things like sports and television shows. It was everything Union Station wasn't, and I was profoundly grateful. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that waiting room full of translucent figures watching for trains that will never arrive. I think about the coal man in the boiler room, eternally maintaining equipment that stopped working before I was born. I think about the custodian who died in that office, now trapped in his own eternal night shift. And I wonder, what happens when there are no more living witnesses? When the last person who can see them leaves and no one takes the midnight shift anymore? Do the ghosts fade, finally released? Or do they continue their routines in absolute solitude, replaying their moments for an audience of no one? I'll never know. I left before the building could make me part of its permanent collection of unfinished souls. But here's what I learned during my 33 nights. Rules exist not to constrain us, but to protect us. Structure isn't a limitation. It's a boundary between ourselves and the chaos that exists in its absence. In a place without rules, you don't find freedom. You find the terrifying responsibility of defining your own reality in an environment where reality is already fractured. Ogden's Union Station stands today, still operating as a museum during daylight hours. They still hire night custodians, and those custodians still rarely last more than a few weeks. The building remains beautiful, historic, and haunted, not by malevolent spirits, but by the simple weight of too much past pressing against too little present. If you ever visit during the day, enjoy the exhibits, admire the architecture, and appreciate the restoration work. But as the afternoon wanes and the staff begins to close up for the night, leave. Don't linger. Don't wonder what it would be like to experience the station after dark. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some absences aren't meant to be filled. And some places, no matter how beautiful, are best experienced only in the light. The midnight shift at Union Station doesn't need rules to be terrifying. It just needs you to stay long enough to realize that the real horror isn't what haunts the building. It's how easily you could become one of the hauntings yourself.